The girl in the back wrote the rain had been falling all afternoon, a slow and steady sound against the windows of the small community hall. Inside, the air felt warm, filled with the faint scent of polished wood and old carpet. People were talking, in low voices, finding their seats, shaking water from their coats. It was the night of the annual piano competition, a tradition the town had kept for decades. The regulars were there, the same teachers, the same young students, the same proud parents holding cameras. Everyone knew each other's faces. Near the back, sitting alone, was someone different. She was young, maybe in her early 20s, wearing a plain coat that still carried drops of rain. Her hair was pulled back without much care, a few loose strands falling across her cheek. She sat with her hands folded, eyes on the floor, as if she didn't want to draw attention. People glanced at her, but didn't stare for long. She didn't look like someone who belonged to any of the local music schools. On stage, the host was calling out names, and one by one, the contestants took their turn. Some played with nervous smiles, others with practiced confidence. Ows. Followed each performance, polite, measured, nothing out of the ordinary. Halfway through the list, the host looked down at the next card and read a name no one in the room seemed to recognize. Heads turned, searching. The girl in the back row stood up slowly. There was something about the way she moved. Not nervous exactly, but quiet, like someone who had learned to pass through life without making ripples. Her steps were soft, her eyes fixed ahead, and she carried no sheet music in her hands. As she walked down the aisle, a few people whispered, "Who is she?" One woman asked her friend. "No idea." "Maybe she's just filling in for someone," the friend replied. She climbed the small set of stairs to the stage and stopped beside the grand piano. It was the largest thing in the room, deep black, gleaming under the warm lights. The bench was set low, the way the previous player had left it. Instead, she rested one hand lightly on the piano's edge, looking at it as if it were an old friend she hadn't seen in years. The judges, 3 of them, seated at a long table in front, glanced at each other. One raised an eyebrow. She was too calm for someone unknown, too still for a beginner. The girl sat down, her posture relaxed but balanced. She placed her hands in her lap and closed her eyes. Seconds passed. People shifted in their seats, unsure. If something was wrong? She didn't look at the keys. She didn't glance at the audience. She simply sat there, breathing slowly. A man in the second row leaned toward his wife and whispered, "Is she meditating?" Finally, she lifted her hands and placed them on the keys, not with a showy gesture, but gently, as if afraid to break something fragile. Still, she didn't play right away. The hall was so quiet that the faint hum of the stage lights could be heard. From the back of the room, a child's voice whispered, "When's she gonna start?" and was quickly hushed by a parent. Then, without warning, the first note rang out. It was soft, not loud enough to make anyone jump, but it had a kind of weight to it. A sound that made the air feel different. She followed it with another, then another, and the melody began to form. People turned in their seats. The tone was warm, rich, and full, the kind of sound that only comes from a player who knows the instrument like their own heartbeat. The girl's fingers moved with a steady rhythm, each note flowing into the next. She wasn't rushing, and she wasn't holding back. Her touch was sure, yet gentle, like water finding its way over smooth stones. The judges stopped writing. One set his pen down completely and leaned back in his chair. Up until that moment, the night had been predictable. Talented students playing pieces they had practiced for months. But this was different. This wasn't just skill. This was something that reached past skill into a place words didn't quite cover. In the back, someone whispered, "She's good." The person next to them shook their heads slowly. "No, she's more than good." The girl didn't notice any of it. Her eyes were still closed, her head tilted slightly as if she were listening to something only she could hear. The music rose and fell, carrying the room with it. The sound wasn't just heard. It was felt, a quiet pull in the chest, a tightening in the throat. When she reached the end of the piece, she didn't lift her hands right away. She let the final note linger, fading into the stillness. And then she opened her eyes. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the applause began, soft at first, then growing louder until it filled the hall. People looked at each other, their expressions mirroring the same thought. They had just seen something rare. The girl in the back row had walked in quietly. But when she played, it was like the Grandmaster herself had returned. The bench and the silence after, the applause settled. The girl gave a small, almost invisible nod to the judges and quietly stepped off the stage. She returned to the same seat in the back row, her hands folded once again, her eyes down. Tried to catch her gaze, maybe to smile or to whisper something, but she didn't look up. It was as if she'd played her piece and closed that chapter immediately. Content to disappear into the background again. The next contestant walked on stage, their shoes tapping loudly against the wooden floor. They adjusted the bench, shuffled their music sheets, and began playing a bright, cheerful tune. It was good, technically correct, fast in all the right places, but somehow it didn't feel the same. The magic from earlier still hung in the room, making the other performances sound smaller. The judges kept glancing back at their score sheets, flipping to her name again. It's almost like they wanted to make sure they'd written it down correctly. When the competition ended for the night, people slowly began putting on coats and scarves, still murmuring about the girl in the back. Some tried to approach her, but she slipped out before anyone could stop her. She didn't wait for the winners to be announced. 2 days later, the hall was opened again for the second round of performances. Rain had returned, falling in thin silver lines outside the tall windows. Inside, the smell of coffee drifted from the refreshment table. Musicians stood in small groups, laughing, talking, tuning instruments. Then, as if stepping straight from the shadows, she appeared again, the same quiet walk, the same plain coat, the same way of blending into the room, without demanding attention. Only this time, a few heads turned the moment she entered. People remembered the competition format had changed for this round, instead of prepared pieces. Each performer had to sight read a piece of music they had never seen before. This was meant to test adaptability, the ability to understand and play something on the spot. It was a challenge even for the most experienced players. One by one, contestants were called. Some did well, others stumbled. The judges took notes, their expressions neutral. When her turn came, she walked to the stage with the same calm steps as before. The host handed her the music sheet. She glanced at it only once, then placed it on the piano. But instead of looking at the notes again, she closed her eyes. The room fell silent. The judges waited for her to begin, but she simply sat there, her fingers lightly touching the keys, not pressing them. The seconds stretched. A cough came from somewhere in the back. A chair creaked. Still, she didn't move. It wasn't an awkward stillness. It felt deliberate, like she was letting the music form in her mind before she let the world hear it. Finally, her hands moved. She played the piece exactly as written, but it didn't sound like sight reading. It sounded like she'd known it all her life. Didn't just follow the notes, she shaped them, lifting certain phrases, softening others, finding the emotion hidden between the lines. It was as if she was uncovering a story that had always been there, waiting for someone to tell it properly. The judges exchanged glances again, and one leaned over to whisper something to the others. By the time she finished, the hall was so still. You could hear the soft hiss of rain outside. When the last note faded, she didn't bow, didn't smile, just stood, nodded politely, and left the stage. During the short break, the room buzzed with talk. She didn't even look at the music after the first glance, one man said, shaking his head in disbelief. Maybe she practiced that piece before, another suggested, said a woman who was a piano teacher. That's a competition only. Score? No one had it until today. In the corner, one of the judges stood alone, looking down at his notes. He had written just a single sentence under her name. She hears before she plays. When the performances ended and the judges left to deliberate, the audience gathered their things. Outside, the rain had turned to a steady drizzle and streetlights. Reflected in the puddles, the girl was nowhere to be seen. She hadn't stayed to hear the results again that night. One of the judges went home and searched online for her name, curious to see if there were any videos, any history, anything that explained her skill. There was almost nothing. Mention in an old local newspaper about a music scholarship she had once been awarded. A blurry photo of her as a child, standing next to a piano, her expression unreadable even then, and then nothing for years. The more he looked, the more questions he had. Who was she? Where had she learned to play like that? Why did she seem so uninterested in recognition? The next round would be the finals, the night the entire town turned up, the night where the winner would be crowned. But no one knew if she would even come. Somehow that made people want to see her even more. The first note, the final night of the competition arrived, and the community hall had never been so full. People stood in the back when all the seats were taken, leaning against the walls, arms crossed, eyes on the stage. The air buzzed with quiet excitement. This wasn't just about the music anymore. It was about her. The whispers had grown over the past week. Some said she had been trained by a famous pianist overseas. Others swore she was self-taught, playing by ear from the time she could walk. No one knew the truth, and she wasn't telling. The rain had stopped hours earlier, but the night air still smelled of wet streets and cold stone. Inside, the warmth of the lights gave the stage a golden glow. A large, polished grand piano sat in the center waiting. The competition began as usual. Contestants played one after another, each delivering strong performances. The applause was kind and polite, but it was clear everyone was waiting for one name to be called. When the host finally said it, the room seemed to lean forward. She appeared at the side of the stage, just as quietly as the first time, her plain coat gone now, placed by a simple dress that brushed her knees. It wasn't fancy, but it was enough to show that she respected the night. Her hair was tied back neatly, no loose strands falling this time. She walked to the piano with her usual unhurried steps. No rush, no tension in her shoulders. Scanned the audience briefly, as if to see the whole room just once before closing herself off from it. The judges watched her closely. I sat forward, elbows on the table, pen held still in his hand. She sat down at the bench, both feet flat on the floor, fingers resting lightly on the keys. And then, nothing. The silence stretched longer than it had in the previous rounds. She didn't even close her eyes this time. She just stared at the keys, as if deciding whether to speak. The room was so quiet that someone in the back dropped a program. The sound made a few heads turn. Then she pressed a single note. It wasn't loud, it wasn't showy, but it had a weight that settled into the chest of everyone listening. There was something about it, a fullness, a depth. Like the first line of a story you know will stay with you forever. The second note followed, then the third, and soon the melody began to form. It was slow at first, almost hesitant, as if she were introducing each note to the audience before letting them meet the next. The sound was warm, rich, and impossibly clear. It wasn't just her skill, it was her control. She knew when to let a note breathe, when to hold it until the last possible moment before moving on. Every rise and fall told you there was something underneath the music, something personal. By the time she reached the middle of the piece, her hands began to move faster. The quiet waves of sound grew into rolling currents, each chord flowing into the next like water rushing over smooth rocks. Her head tilted slightly, her expression calm but focused, her breathing steady in the front row. An older woman clasped her hands together and closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. Next to her, a teenage boy leaned forward, his eyes wide, as if trying to memorize every movement of her fingers. The judges had stopped writing entirely, and then something changed. The melody shifted. It became softer again, almost like a whisper after an outburst. It was a conversation in music, the kind you don't need words for. You could almost feel her speaking to someone who wasn't in the room. People later swore. They saw her eyes glisten for just a moment, though no one could be sure in the stage lights. As she approached the final passage, the sound grew again. Not in volume, but in intensity. It was like watching a storm build far away, each note another flash of lightning in the distance. And then she stopped suddenly. Her hands hovered above the keys, frozen. A breath later, she struck the last note. It was soft, gentle, but it rang out long enough for everyone to hear it fade into the air. Like the end of a sentence you don't want to finish. She let her hands fall into her lap. The room held its breath. The applause didn't start immediately this time. There was a moment, just one heartbeat, where no one seemed willing to break the spell. And then, as if all at once, the hall erupted in clapping, cheering, and even a few shouts of approval. But she didn't smile. She didn't bow. She simply stood, nodded once toward the judges, and stepped away from the piano as she walked off the stage. People in the aisles reached out as if to stop her, to ask her name, to tell her what she had just done to them. She slipped past every hand without breaking her stride. When she disappeared behind the side curtain, the room still felt like it was holding on to her last note. The room changes the moment she stepped behind the curtain. The room didn't go back to normal, it couldn't. It was as if her music had left something behind, the soft echo in the air that refused to fade. People were still clapping, even though she was no longer on stage. Some stood up, not because it was tradition, but because it felt wrong to stay seated after what they had just witnessed. The judges hadn't moved. One still sat leaning forward, pen in hand but forgotten. Another rested her chin on her palm, eyes fixed on the empty bench where the girl had been sitting moments before. For the first time that night, the host didn't rush to announce the next contestant. He stood at the side of the stage, almost hesitant to speak, as if worried any noise might break whatever spell had been cast. When the next pianist was finally called, the shift was obvious. The new performer played with skill, every note technically perfect, but the audience wasn't the same. They were polite, attentive, but the spark had dimmed. Heads didn't lean forward in the same way. The music was just music again. Backstage, she stood alone in a narrow hallway, the muffled sound of applause reaching her from the stage. Her hands were folded loosely in front of her, and she stared at the worn carpet beneath her shoes. Someone brushed past her, another performer hurrying to get ready. She stepped aside without a word. A stage assistant, an older man with kind eyes, stopped for a moment and said quietly, "That was something special." She gave him a small nod but didn't answer. It wasn't rudeness. It was as if she truly had nothing to add out in the audience. The conversations had started. "I've been coming to this competition for 15 years. One man said to the woman beside him, "And I've never seen anyone like her." "She doesn't play to win," the woman replied. "She plays like she's remembering." In another row, a young boy tugged at his father's sleeve. "Can I learn to play like that?" he asked. The father smiled faintly, knowing it wasn't just about lessons. By the time the final contestant finished and the applause died down, everyone was waiting for the announcement of the winner. The host stepped forward, carrying a small envelope, his expression giving nothing away. "The first place in this year's competition," he began, "goes to..." He read her name. The crowd erupted, this time without hesitation. The applause began. People glanced toward the stage wings, expecting her to appear again. She didn't. The host looked toward the curtain, a slight frown crossing his face. He tried again. "Would the winner please come forward?" No movement. Stage assistant hurried backstage, and a few moments later returned alone, shaking his head. "She's gone," he whispered to the host. Somewhere outside. On the dimly lit street, she walked with the same calm steps as always. The night was cold, her breath visible in the air, but she didn't hurry. In her hand, she carried a folded piece of paper, the score she had played earlier, and nothing else. She didn't need the trophy. She didn't need the applause. Her music had always been for something else entirely. The next morning, the local newspaper ran a headline, "The Quiet Girl Who Stole the Night." The article described her performance in glowing detail but admitted no one knew much about her. Competition organizers had her name, but no contact details beyond a mailing address that led to a small, weathered house on the edge of town. Within days, a grainy video of her performance appeared online, filmed. From the back of the hall, The sound wasn't perfect, but it didn't matter. The emotion still came through. Comments flooded in. It's made me cry and I don't even know why. She plays like she's telling you a secret. It feels alive. Back in the town, people began to notice her in small, unexpected places. A cafe owner swore she came in once or twice a week, always ordering tea. Sometimes sitting at the old upright piano in the corner and playing for herself. A bus driver claimed she once boarded his route with a music book tucked under her arm, lost in thought. She never stayed long. She never stayed anywhere long. For the judges, her absence lingered. One of them found himself replaying her opening. Note in his mind, during quiet moments, wondering why it felt like the start of a story left unfinished. Another admitted to searching through old recordings, trying to find someone who played with the same balance of precision and heart. They didn't find it in the weeks that followed. The hall felt different. The annual competition had ended. The chairs stacked away, the piano covered and silent. But for those who had been there that night, the room no longer felt like just a room. It felt like a place where something rare had happened, something they might never see again. And every now and then, when the town gathered for other events, someone would glance toward the back row, half expecting to see her sitting there, coat damp from the rain, waiting for her name to be called. Whispers in the crowd the night after the competition. The little town cafe on Main Street was unusually busy. It wasn't because of the coffee or the warm lights spilling onto the wet pavement. It was because people were still talking about her. At every table, someone was telling their version of the story. A couple near the window spoke in low voices. "I swear I've seen her before," the woman said, wrapping her hands around a steaming mug. "She used to sit in the corner here, late at night, just playing softly when nobody else was around." The man across from her raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" "She didn't seem like the kind who plays for strangers." "She didn't play for strangers," the woman replied. "She played for herself. That's the difference." At another table, two music students leaned in close over their textbooks. "You know who she might be?" the first one said, lowering his voice. "I heard she's the daughter of that famous orchestra pianist who disappeared years ago, the one who just stopped performing." The other shook her head. "That's just a story." Looked it up. No proof. Maybe she's just someone. "Who practiced a lot?" "Practiced a lot?" The first student scoffed. "You don't practice your way into playing like that. It's something else." Even the competition judges weren't immune to the speculation. At a small diner on the edge of town, one of them sat with his coffee untouched, playing the moment in his mind, the stillness before her first note, the weight in the air when she stopped playing. He'd seen countless talented musicians in his career, but she was different. It was almost as if she wasn't performing for anyone. She was playing through something, as though each note was carrying the weight of a memory. 2 days later, the whispers followed her again. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and the bookstore down the street was quiet except for the sound of rain against the windows. A few people browsing the shelves noticed her walking in. She didn't head toward the music section, as they might have expected. Instead, she went straight to a small corner in the back and picked up an old, worn book of poetry. An older man, who had been at the competition, recognized her immediately. He waited for her to glance up, so he could say something, maybe tell her how her performance had stayed with him, but she didn't. She bought the book, gave the cashier a small smile, and walked back into the rain without an umbrella. By the time he stepped outside, she was already halfway down the street, her figure disappearing into the gray mist. The more people noticed her, the more the story spread. One cafe regular claimed she had once been offered a spot at a prestigious music school but turned it down. A woman who worked at the post office swore she'd mailed a letter to an address overseas written in her careful handwriting. The letter had no return address. Some believed she'd been hurt in the past, maybe by the industry, maybe by people she trusted, and that's why she avoided attention. Others thought she simply loved music too much to turn it into competition. But no matter what version they told, the ending was always the same. She walked away, and yet there were small moments when she seemed to leave traces of herself behind. A week later, the old upright piano in the back of the cafe, the one most people ignored, was found with a fresh sheet of handwritten music resting on it. No one saw who left it, but when the cafe owner played it, customers swore it sounded like the melody she had played during the competition. The same thing happened at the community hall. One of the stage assistants, cleaning up after a different event, found a single sheet of music on the bench of the grand piano. There was no name on it, just notes written in a style so fluid and precise that it could only have been hers. It was as if she was still around. Even when she wasn't seen, the whispers turned into a quiet kind of obsession for some. People started checking the back row of every small concert, every open mic night, every gathering where a piano might be played. They didn't always see her, but when they did, they never forgot it. One evening, during a free outdoor concert in the park, she appeared without warning. She didn't sit at the front. She didn't ask to play. She just stood at the edge of the crowd, listening, her eyes closed, the faintest smile on her face. By the time someone worked up the courage to invite her on stage, she was gone again. For those who had been in the hall that rainy night, her music had done something they couldn't explain. It wasn't just beauty or talent or skill. It was the way it made them feel like they had been led into a moment that wasn't meant for them. A moment too private and too raw to be repeated on demand. And that was the thing. But maybe it couldn't be repeated. Maybe that's why she walked away every time. The mystery didn't fade. If anything, it grew deeper, somewhere in quiet corners and rainy streets. She kept playing, not for the crowd, not for the judges, but for whatever it was that had always called her to the piano. In the first place, the question it was a week after the charity event when the chance finally came. The weather had shifted, no rain this time. It's just a soft winter chill that made the air crisp and clear. The streets were quiet, save for the hum of passing cars, and the occasional sound of footsteps on the sidewalk. A man named Daniel, a local photographer who had been at both the competition and the fundraiser, spotted her in the park. She was sitting alone on a worn wooden bench near the duck pond, a small notebook balanced on her lap. For a moment, he almost didn't approach. She had that same stillness she carried on stage, the kind that made it feel wrong to disturb her. But he'd been replaying her performances in his mind for weeks, and he couldn't let the chance slip away again. He walked slowly, making sure she could hear his steps before he reached her. She looked up as he stopped beside the bench. Eyes were calm, unbothered, as if she had expected him. "Do you mind if I sit?" he asked. She gave a small nod. Closing the notebook and placing it beside her, they sat in silence for a moment. "Watching the ripples on the pond, I saw you at the competition," Daniel began, "and again at the fundraiser. Both times you—" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "You did something to the room, to the people in it. I've never seen that before." Her gaze drifted back to the water. She didn't say anything, but he could tell she was listening, I guess. "What I'm trying to ask is," he exhaled, his voice softening. "Why? Why do you play like that, and then leave before anyone can talk to you?" Her eyes stayed on the pond for a long moment before she answered. "Because it's not for them," she said finally. Her voice was quiet but steady. "It's not for applause or trophies. It's for someone who isn't here anymore." Daniel didn't speak right away. The weight of her words hung between them, heavier than the cold air. She leaned back slightly, her hands resting in her lap. "When I was little, someone used to sit with me every night at the piano. Not to teach me, not to correct me, just to listen. He told me once, 'Play like you're telling me everything you can't say out loud.'" Her lips curved faintly, but it wasn't quite a smile. "They're gone now. But when I play, I can almost feel them there again." Just for a little while, Daniel glanced at the notebook beside her. "Is that what you were writing about?" She shook her head. "Music, it's always music. Even when it's not on a piano, I have to put it somewhere." The wind moved through the bare branches overhead, scattering a few dry leaves across. "The path, don't you want people to know?" he asked. "What you can do, the way it changes things." Her eyes met his then, and there was something clear and unwavering in them. "If they listen, they'll know. I don't have to explain it. I don't want to." They sat quietly again, the conversation drifting into stillness. Eventually, she picked up the notebook and stood. "I should go," she said softly. "Daniel, hesitated, then asked the question that had been sitting in the back of his mind since the first time he heard her play. "Will you ever let the world really hear you?" She tilted her head, considering it. Then, after a pause, she said, "The right world will find me when it's ready." With that, she turned and began walking toward the far path, her steps as quiet as they had been the night. She walked up to the piano for the first time. Daniel stayed on the bench long after she was gone. He realized something as he sat there. The mystery wasn't the point. The point was that her music had reached him just as it had reached everyone else who had heard it. And maybe that was enough. That evening, he developed the photos he'd taken during the competition. One in particular stood out, her sitting at the piano, her eyes closed, her hands just above the keys. In that frozen moment, she looked weightless, as if the music itself was holding her up. He printed the photo and pinned it to the corkboard above his desk. Underneath it, he wrote a single word, "Why?" Not as a question anymore, but as a reminder. In the weeks that followed, her presence in town became even more fleeting. Some saw her once at the train station, a worn leather bag at her side. Others swore she'd been spotted in a small music shop in a city 2 hours away. Each story ended the same way, with her leaving before anyone could get close. But her music didn't leave. It stayed in the minds of those who had heard it, replaying at unexpected moments in the quiet of early morning, in the rhythm of raindrops on a window, in the hush just before sleep, for Daniel and for many others. That was enough to keep waiting, hoping that one day she might sit down at a piano again, and this time, they'd be there when she did. The legacy of a quiet entrance moons had passed since anyone had seen her. The competition was now just a framed photo on the wall of the community hall, a snapshot of the night she won. Though in truth, the photo captured her only in profile as she sat at the piano. It was the only image they had of her on stage, and it still drew people's eyes when they walked past. But the memory was still alive. It had worked its way into conversations the way old treasured stories do. People didn't say if she would return, they said when. And no one ever doubted that she would. In the cafe where some swore they'd first heard her play quietly in the corner. A small wooden sign now hung above the old upright piano, reserved for the quiet girl, the owner. Kept it polished even though weeks would pass without anyone touching it. On slow afternoons, he would run his fingers over the keys and imagine he could still feel the weight of her hands there at the bookstore. The clerk kept a little notebook behind the counter with pages filled by customers who wanted to share where they were when they first heard her play. The notes ranged from a few simple words, "She made me cry," to full paragraphs, describing moments she had unknowingly changed. It was as though she had left behind a trail without ever meaning to, a string of invisible threads connecting. Strangers, through the memory of her music, Daniel, the photographer, still carried his photo of her wherever he went. He didn't frame it anymore. Instead, he kept it in his bag, folded gently in the same notebook where he sketched ideas. Whenever he felt stuck or uninspired, he would pull it out and look at it, not for answers, but as a reminder that sometimes the most powerful moments don't need explanation. One rainy evening, the community hall hosted a small winter recital for local students. The chairs were half full, the sound of light chatter filling the room. The piano sat in the same place it always had, its surface catching the reflection of the overhead lights. Just before the event began, someone noticed a small, folded piece of paper resting on the bench. The host picked it up, curious, and unfolded. It was a handwritten piece of music. No title, no name, just a melody, written in careful, flowing script. The notes seemed unfamiliar, but when the host sight-read the first few bars quietly to himself, he recognized the feeling instantly. There was no question who had written it. The host placed it on the piano, but he didn't mention it to the students. He simply left it there, as if it were waiting for the right person to find it, and so it began to happen in small ways, her influence appearing where no one expected it. A music student at the high school performed a hauntingly beautiful piece at graduation, later admitting it came from a sheet of music I found on the cafe piano. A young man who had once been too shy to play in front of others signed up for an open, Mike Knight after hearing her at the fundraiser. Each time, the person didn't claim the music as their own. They spoke of her, the girl who walked in quietly and played like she carried the weight of an entire life in her hands. Over time, her story shifted from whispers to something closer to legend. In the retellings, her dress might be described as different, the weather on that first night, sunnier or colder. The exact piece she played, changing slightly with each version. But the heart of the story stayed the same. A quiet girl entered, played as if she'd lived 1,000 lifetimes, left before the applause could touch her. Some people claimed they'd spotted her in other towns, always near a piano, always, slipping away before anyone could stop her. Whether those sightings were true or just wishful thinking didn't matter. What mattered was that the hope never faded. And then, one spring morning, Daniel received a small envelope in the mail. No return address, no note inside, just a single sheet of music. The handwriting was the same as the piece left on the community hall piano. At the bottom, in small, almost hidden letters, were 4 words: "For the right world." Daniel smiled as he held it. He didn't need to find her anymore. She was still speaking, still leaving pieces of herself behind in the only way she knew how. Years later, when people would talk about the most memorable performances the town had ever seen, they would always begin with the same sentence: "You remember the night she walked in quietly?" And the rest everyone already knew.